Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be talking about my October wrap-up. This was a bit of an odd month, so I can't lie. September and October have been very, very busy, just in terms of family things and work things. And excitingly for me, but leaving less time for reading in October, I started piano lessons. Well, it was really at the end of September, but I don't think I talked about it here. So I started taking piano lessons, which has been really fun, but obviously I'm taking some time to practice and learn the theory and all those things. I grew up in a really, really small town, so I actually had no piano or no music at all in school because our school was just too small. There was no music teacher, and I didn't live close enough to anyone who taught music lessons of any type to take them, but I have always wanted to play piano. Number one, I have giant hands, which I don't know if you can tell on a booktube video, but very, very long fingers, so I can span the keys very well, and I also just like the way that piano sounds. So I have wanted to learn for a really long time, and now I am starting. So that has been interesting. My son, who is in grade 2, is also starting at the same time and probably will progress faster than me because he's got one of those little elastic children's brains. So we'll see how that goes, but we're both enjoying it a lot so far. And I also found a badminton group to play with. So I was a competitive badminton player for a really long time, and then a casual recreational badminton player afterward. And I have not been playing for the past 3 years, and I really, really missed it. So it was very exciting to find a group and to find some players, some of whom are actually pretty competitive, which is nice. You know, when you're in a smaller place, you're never sure what level of play you're going to find. So those have been two really good things for me personally in October, but obviously leaves less time for reading. So I still read a fair amount in October, and I'm very happy with the balance. So I'm thinking that with everything that I have to do now, this is probably going to be the new normal in terms of reading. And it just means that I will probably end up reading anywhere from 6 to 8 books a month instead of anywhere from 10 to 12 books a month. And I'm happy with that. In October, we also had a lot of fun things happening on the Discord. So I know I talk about the Discord a lot, but it feels like the October wrap-up is the appropriate place to talk about it. There's a really good group of friends that hang out on the Discord. I always link the Discord in all of my videos. And in October, we did a bunch of meetups. We played some games together. We did some voice chats that lasted the entire day with people just coming in and out over the course of the day. And I think the group is getting a lot more comfortable with hopping into the voice chat and organizing those kinds of group events. And especially when life is really busy and free time is limited, it's nice to have a group of friends that you can spend time with online, and especially who are into the same kinds of things that you are. So if you are missing that kind of group connection in your life, then feel free to jump into Discord. And like I said, we usually try to get together to play some sort of game or just have a chat or something like that. The idea of a really horrible movies club was brought up, so that's something that we might also be exploring sometime in the near future. But I will get down to the books now and tell you all about the books that I read in October. As usual, I'm just going to read them from my book journal, and there are 7 of them for October. So I read 7 books this month, and I actually haven't looked at the star ratings at all. I had 0 5 stars, which is a bit of a bummer for this month, but I did have 1 4.5 star, and then I had 1, 2, 3, 4 4 stars, and then 1, 2, 3.5 stars. So it was not a month where I read a lot of new favorites, but I was enjoying the things that I was reading. There weren't any that I felt like I was suffering through, but it was just not, I guess, the highest of highs for October. The first book of the month actually was the one that I gave the highest rating. So that one was my 4.5 star read. And that is A Ghost in the Throat by, and I think I tried to listen to the audiobook narrator pronounce the author's name right before I started this video, and I believe it's pronounced Doreen Nagirfa, but she is an Irish author, and I listened to this book on audiobook, and it was narrated by an Irish narrator. It was not the author, but the person who narrated the book was also Irish and did a beautiful job of narrating. This is a book that I actually heard someone talk about in the Grimoire Discord, which is a great place to hang out as well if you're looking for a bookish community to join. But someone had also listened to the audiobook and said, this totally blew me away. This was one of the first books about motherhood where I felt like I could truly understand what it was like to be a mom in all of the kind of isolation, but also the beautiful moments. And it was a very intimate read. And I looked it up on Audible because I'm always looking for some audiobooks to throw on to the TBR. I hadn't heard anything about this one, and I picked it up. And it was beautiful. It is a gorgeous, gorgeous audiobook. If you are looking to add some, I think I classified this as literary fiction in my reading journal, but I guess it's probably also would fit the bill for nonfiction. So what it is a semi-memoir by the author who is recounting the impression that a poem by an Irish author named Eileen Dove, that poem and the impact that it had on her as a young woman, and how the way that she read that poem, which is supposed to be a lament of sorts about a woman whose husband is killed and her reaction to that grief. So it is about how she processed that poem as a young woman, so as a teenager, and then as she made her way through life, what that poem meant to her, how it shaped her life, and the impact that it had on her. And I think, number one, it's a great book for people who love reading because it is about this woman's borderline obsession with this poem and with the woman who wrote it. And it shows what a powerful influence literature can be on your life, how it can direct the flow of your life, how it can help you make major life decisions. It can influence the path that you take, the age that you read something, how that impacts you and what it does to you. So it was, like I said, it was a beautiful book. We learn a lot about the author and her struggles at various points in her life. And there is a lot about motherhood. So the author is a mother. Motherhood plays a major role in this poem. And as the author is trying to find out more about this poem, which is also autobiographical, and she's trying to find out more about the author, she learns how this author's history has been lost and how she has been defined through history by her children or by her family members and not for who she was as a person. So it's a little bit about how parts of your identity can become absorbed by that mantle of motherhood. And it's really hard to tell you any more than that because in the vein of literary or poetic fiction, there's not a lot that happens. Like it's just about that exploration, but it was beautiful. The audiobook is excellent. There's something so haunting and so powerful about listening to it. I will absolutely listen to this again. And this is a book that I could see myself buying for people because I just think that it is very unique, very refreshing, and just a gorgeous read. So if you like literary fiction and you're looking for something a little bit different to add to your TBR, I could not recommend that highly enough. After A Ghost in the Throat, I went on to read The Winners. So this was one of my most anticipated books of the year. This is the finale of Frederick Bachman's Beartown trilogy. And for anyone who has never heard me talk about Beartown, I really loved the first novel, Beartown. I gave it 5 stars. The second book, which is called Us Against You, I liked because I was really attached to the characters from Beartown, but I found that it leaned a little more into the melodrama. So some of the writing, the situations, the scenarios, they felt a little contrived and as if they were put in there for the sake of bringing out a really strong reaction. So I did not enjoy it as much as Beartown. However, because I do really love these characters and I was really attached to them, I absolutely wanted to read The Winners as soon as it came out. And I had mixed feelings about it. So this is one of the ones that I gave 3.5 stars. And it was too long. Number one, it's very thick. It is like, I don't think it's double the other books, but it is certainly like an extra 25% on top of the previous books. And it did not need to be that long, but I'm torn because I understand, because it's very clear when you read this book that Frederick Bachman is also really attached to these characters. And you can tell that he wants to make sure that we get everybody's story. We get to know what happens to everyone who had a part to play in the story, whether it was a minor role or a major role. And because of that, there's a lot of fleshing out of different characters, about their backstories, things that happened to them. And I don't think that it was all necessary to wrap up the central plot and to kind of bring around those central themes of the trilogy at large. So it was too long. It was not unenjoyable in its length, because I think that Frederick Bachman's exploration of characters is interesting, but it left some people feeling a little flat to me, because I didn't think we got enough time with certain characters. And there was a lot of repetition of similar lines, similar ideas, to the point where there would be full sentences and I'd be like, oh my gosh, like I read this 2 chapters ago and then 2 chapters before that. And it's kind of like hammering that point really, really well. So I thought it was just too much. I think that it could have used an edit. I think that this is a problem that happens a lot when series grow to this astronomical popularity. Once they start, making waves in the literary community, authors tend to get a little more leeway, it seems, from their publishing teams and their editors. And I just think that even though there's a lot of good in here, someone needed to be merciless and cut it down so that we could get what we needed from the story. And then potentially Frederick Bachman could have gone on to write more about this community or more about the side characters that he wanted to explore. I did think that the character arcs for the characters that I loved and enjoyed were very satisfying. This was an emotional book, but it did not make me as emotional as I had hoped. And I think a lot of that was because of this buildup that just kept going and going. I felt like my feet were starting to drag a little bit. And I think that the really emotional moments could have been much more hard-hitting had the book been shorter. But I'm really glad that I read it. I would certainly read Beartown again. I don't know that I will read through the entire trilogy again, but I will probably pick through and read my favorite passages. I still really recommend it if you're looking for an emotional, hard-hitting, contemporary work of fiction. So I don't think that this should make you not want to read the series. I think if you love the characters from Beartown, you'll be happy enough to read through the trilogy. I just personally wish that it had been edited a little bit more tightly. After that, we had The Ogress and the Orphans by Kelly Barnhill. So I love The Girl Who Drank the Moon by this same author, and I picked up this book on a whim. I talked about it a couple of months ago, and it was really delightful. It did not get the full 5 stars like The Girl Who Drank the Moon, but it did get a solid 4 stars. And I actually think that I would probably read it to my kids before The Girl Who Drank the Moon, because I think it reads just a little bit younger. There's still some difficult topics, still some tough things to talk through, but I just think it's a little bit more accessible to younger children than The Girl Who Drank the Moon. And it is more Fable-esque. So it has that kind of whimsical writing style that you will find if you have read The Girl Who Drank the Moon. I personally really like that. It feels very fairy tale-esque. It feels beautiful and lyrical, and it just helps me get lost in the story. But The Ogress and the Orphans is a book with a message. It feels like a classic, like Aesop's fable. Like, you know that there is a message with a capital M in the middle of this book, and you don't have to dig very hard or very far to find it. But I think that's appropriate. It is aimed at a younger audience, and it's still really enjoyable. The characters were delightful. I really like the way that she builds her worlds together. There's a lot about the importance of reading, the importance of books and learning and community, and those are all things that I enjoy. Her author's note at the end of this book was particularly beautiful as well, and I just like the way that Kelly Barnhill thinks about writing and thinks about reading and thinks about books. So I think she's just going to be an author whose books I can pick up at any time and enjoy them. And I will hope that someday one will hit me in the exact right way, just like The Girl Who Drank the Moon did. But absolutely, I would recommend The Ogress and the Orphans. Like I said, I'm planning to read it to my kids sometime soon. After that was Babel. So this is the book that everybody on BookTube read last month, but I saved until October to read as part of the buddy read for the channel. And I think that many of us felt similarly about Babel. This is another one of the ones that got a 3.5 star rating from me. And I did go back and forth a little bit on Babel, but whether or not I was going to give it 3.5 or 4 stars, because again, my feelings about this one are very conflicted. I don't think I need to give a summary for Babel. Like I said, everybody on BookTube has been reading it. It is about a boy named Robin who his was plucked from his native China, brought to England and raised in Britain to work for the colony, or not for the colony, for the colonizer, for the empire, and to translate at the Institute of Babel at Oxford University. So he's expected to go and study at Babel and to do what is called silver working, which is where they use bars of silver to create advancements in society. So they translate words and then they inscribe these translations in the bars in order to create kind of workarounds or to advance society in some way. And sometimes these are very powerful and they can do things that are great for the people at large. And sometimes they are entirely frivolous and are meant only as a source of income, from the higher classes. They're more of a status symbol than anything else. But in order to be effective at utilizing this magic, you need to know the language that you are manipulating like the back of your hand. You need to be able to dream in it. You need to be able to converse in it. You need to be able to understand the nuances, not just the vocabulary, but you need to be able to live in the language, which is why the students at Babel are often students who have been taken from their homelands. They are people who were raised in a different environment, and then they were kind of forcibly removed from their parents, from their families, in order to come and work for the British Empire. And in terms of ideas, I think Babel was a revolution in itself. I think that this was an amazing idea by Rebecca Kuang. I think that this was clearly inspired by some of her own experiences, by her own PhD work, by the topics that she finds interesting about history and about the history of colonization in particular. And I was so deeply impressed by the idea of the story, the bones of the story, the skeleton of the story. The magic system, so cool. That I don't even really like the word magic system or the phrase magic system. The magic, the way that the magic works is so interesting. I, like many of us on BookTube, I'm sure, love words, love wordplay, love language. And so seeing how that plays out in terms of magic was so fun, so interesting. I thought that the pacing was very good here. I know some people find the book to be a little bit slow because there is a lot of instructional time there's a lot of time in the classroom where information definitely feels like it's a little bit info dumpy because it's being communicated either from professor to student or from student to student. But again, Rebecca Kuang captures that feeling of being in university, being someone who loves what they are studying, who loves learning, who wants to push themselves to learn more. She captures that so well. And actually, she did a really good job of this in Poppy War as well. It's easy to tell when someone's nerdy when they're writing their books. And I mean that like in a very positive, affectionate way. It brought back a lot of memories from my early university days and how it feels to finally connect with people that understand you and who want the same things as you. And maybe you didn't get that earlier in your life and you were isolated. And it's like a whole new world is being opened up to you. The connections between the students, because the main character is Robin, but we also have his 3 best friends who are part of his cohort for that year at Babel, who make up a major part of the story, and the way that they bond and the things that they find in common and the way they relate to one another, also very relatable for anyone who has been in a similar situation. My difficulties with this book, really my main complaint, and your mileage may vary here and people may disagree with me, and I would love to know what you think. But to me, this was a book that it seems like after reading it, it was a book that Rebecca Kuang needed to write. Like it feels like she just bled this onto the page and that it took from her and she gave to it, and it feels like it was a very cathartic book to write. What I wish is that it had been written or that she had saved it to write further in her career, because I think that it's easy to see the improvements in her writing and her as an author as you go from the Poppy War through that series and then into this book. But this feels like the kind of book that I think could have been one of the best fantasy books of all time. I really do think that, based on the ideas and the magic and just the way that it all comes together, I think that it could have been that. And for me, it definitely could have been one of my favorite books of all time. But I think that there are just parts of the story technically that have nothing to do with theme or character or anything else, but impact those things because of the way that they're carried out. I think that there are some plot conveniences that could have used a little extra editing. I think that some of the way that the narrative unfolds is clunky. There are definitely choices that were made that I think distance you from the characters and hold you back from really getting to know them or becoming as attached to them as you possibly could have been. However, there's so many people for whom this was a 5-star read. So obviously, some people did not have these same difficulties or these same complaints. I just think for me, it came within reach of being something that I could love so much. And I'm sad that it did not reach that height. I still think that it's a fantastic book. I think that it is an extraordinary effort in terms of a standalone fantasy novel. And I do think it's very much worth reading. I will say it is very thematically heavy, and it deals with themes of racism and colonialism and exploitation and advocacy and allyship. Like, there's a ton of stuff in here that's very heavy, and it is not, and I think intentionally so, by Rebecca Kuang, it's not like this is subtle. It is not a nuanced take on any of these topics. This is something that she is going to make sure that you understand is the purpose for this book, and it is going to be very clear from the book to the footnotes to the character interactions. Like, this was her goal and she achieved it. I'm not going to say whether that is the proper or improper way to approach a story like that, because I don't think there's a right answer. It's just what you prefer and what you like to get out of your books and how you like those things to be displayed, how you like them to be written. And I think for me, it just didn't reach the heights that I was hoping it was going to. But I am very glad that I read it, and I will certainly continue to read Rebecca Kuang's work because I think that she has a great imagination, and I think that she has a brilliant way of creating a story. I'm just looking forward to seeing her grow as an author as she continues to hone her craft. But that was Babel. After that, the 5th book of the month was Fall of Hyperion. So this was actually our buddy read on the channel for September. But I was reading a lot of chunky books and I just couldn't get through it in time for the library checkout that I had taken. So I decided to switch over to audiobook, and I didn't have a lot of audio time to listen. So it took me up until October to finally get through it. But Fall of Hyperion, again, so many mixed opinions on all of the books this month. October was the month of mixed opinions, but Fall of Hyperion, in the end, I ended up giving a 4 stars. I wonder if I had not been listening to it on audio, if potentially I would have DNF'd it. I'm really glad that that didn't happen, but I have to say that the beginning of the book, this book is, I think it has 3 parts. So definitely for the first part and maybe even halfway through the second part, it was not what I was hoping. Hyperion, I loved. In terms of like narrative structure and the way that the book was formulated, the way that it was carried out, I thought it was brilliant. I loved it. I loved the open ending. I would have been happy if it ended there. And initially when I was reading Fall of Hyperion, I was kind of wishing that it had ended there because I was not getting what I wanted from the characters that we leave off at the end of Hyperion. I was not really enjoying the direction that the narrative seemed to be going in. However, I do think that the latter half, or at least like the latter 30% of the book, redeemed it as a whole, and it ended up being a book that I did really enjoy. It did not reach the same heights as Hyperion because I think Hyperion is something that stands apart. I just think that it is an excellent use of storytelling, of narrative structure, of framing. There's just so many cool things about Hyperion. And Fall of Hyperion is much more your classic sci-fi that does borrow on some of the kind of like deeper intellectual sorts of themes from Hyperion, but it's presented in a much more typical way in terms of, you know, classic sci-fi. But I am glad that I read it. I really enjoyed the ending. I liked the way that everything ended up. I enjoyed the exploration. I thought that it was really cool. It just didn't become an all-time favorite like Hyperion did. And now the question is whether or not to go on to Endymion. And Rise of Endymion, I think, is the next book. I think that I will. I was talking to some people on Discord, and I think there are some other people who do want to check it out. And I have heard that it is different enough from the other two that you really want to make an opinion. Like, are you going to be one of the ones who loves it or one of the ones who hates it? And I want to know. So I think I will continue on. But I'm going in now with like much more tempered expectations because I don't expect anything to live up to Hyperion now. I am ready to be pleasantly surprised, and I am curious about what is going to happen, but it doesn't need to be Hyperion in order for me to enjoy it. But I am really glad in the end that I read Fall of Hyperion. If I end up enjoying the rest of the cantos, then I'll probably do a series review at the end of everything. After that was a little bit more sci-fi in that I continued on with the new volume of Saga that was released. So in October, the newest bind-up, or the first bind-up of Saga since its hiatus many years ago, was released, and I pre-ordered it, and my husband and I both read it right away, and we both really had similar reactions to it, which was that yay, this is Saga, and we're so excited that it is continuing. This was so good and also so sad, because if you have read Saga, you know that it is fantastic, but it's also heartbreaking. Like, so many sad things happen, and they just keep happening, and then you'll get brief flashes of joy, and you're like, oh yes, finally, and then it just means that it's gonna hurt more, basically. Like, in 10 pages, just save your feelings, save your happiness, use it as a shield, because pretty soon the knife is coming. And that is what happened in this volume. I really enjoyed it, looking forward to it. I'm excited that this series is back on the go, and I don't think I'm going to read it by individual issue. I will just keep waiting for the bind-ups, and I'm looking forward to number 11 when it does come. Finally, the last book of the month is another sci-fi leaning one. And that was my nonfiction for the month, and that was In Other Worlds, which is a work of nonfiction by Margaret Atwood. I gave this one 4 stars as well. If you have never heard me talk about it before, Margaret Atwood is one of my favorite authors. She writes Canadian fiction / literary fiction, and she is definitely, I'm trying to think if you classify Stephen King as like a quasi-fantasy author, I wonder if Margaret Atwood is my favorite non-fantasy author. I love her imagination. I love her books. She is a great point of contention between myself and my husband, because he absolutely despises her books and I absolutely love them. But I like everything of hers that I have read up to this point. I have not read her entire bibliography. It's something that I'm slowly working my way through, but her books are very common in like either high school or university courses in Canada. So lots of people get exposed to Margaret Atwood. I'm sure lots more people know who she is now because of the success of the Handmaid's Tale TV show. So even if you were someone who is not really into like literary fiction or Canadian fiction, I'm sure you probably know who Margaret Atwood is. But she made some statements about science fiction, like, I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago, I can't remember, about how she didn't feel like the books that she had written, like The Handmaid's Tale and other books of hers, like Oryx and Crake, which is a dystopian style of fiction, that they weren't science fiction, that they were speculative fiction. And I think some people took umbrage at that statement and thought, like, oh, well, Margaret Atwood is too high and mighty to be a science fiction author. And her writing this book was a rebuttal or an answer to that belief. And it was really, really good. If you like nonfiction about the history of sci-fi or fantasy, about authors and their processes, I would really highly recommend this. This is more about sci-fi than fantasy. And it starts off, the beginning of the book is just about her upbringing. She grew up in a very isolated community in northern Canada. She didn't have a lot of access to anything except books. It was a post-World War II environment. And she talks about how those things impacted her and what an escape science fiction was for her. She talks about her early stories and how science fiction really impacted her. And also she talks a lot about, she is an academic, so she worked at the University of Toronto. I don't believe she finished her PhD, but she started her PhD. She talks about that a little bit in this book. And she likes to examine why we read and why certain types of literature mean a lot to us. So she talks a lot about the growth of sci-fi as a genre and kind of links that to the rise of anthropology and sociology and how those things impacted sci-fi as a genre as well. it was really fascinating. I like books like this a lot, and I had a great time reading it. I think Margaret Atwood's very witty. I think she has a very easy style to get into. So the beginning of the book is about the evolution of the genre, and then she does some critical breakdown of famous sci-fi classics. So these ones are full of spoilers, and they're for books like Brave New World, 1984. She talks about the book She talks about The Time Machine, about Gulliver's Travels. She talks about a lot of those kind of speculative classics that helped to build sci-fi as a genre. Frankenstein, obviously. And so there are a lot of spoilers for that. Now, these are classics, and to me, I had read many of them, and the ones that I had not read, I didn't mind being spoiled for them when I got to read about them in this way, about how they pulled from other books, how certain books were influenced by them. These kinds of classics are the types of books that I would read whether or not I had been spoiled on them. It really makes no difference to me. So that is the kind of middle chunk of the book, and again, I found that highly enjoyable. And then the end is just some of her forays into science fiction. Excuse me. So she has like some short stories, some excerpts from talks that she had given, some of her own just like, thoughts, her own little thought bubbles about sci-fi. And it was delightful. I really enjoyed reading it. I've had it here forever. I don't know why I haven't read it before now, but it was a great time. If you are looking for some nonfiction that centers around sci-fi, then again, like I said, I would highly recommend picking it up. But that was it. That was my reading for October. I've got a ton of great books lined up for November. And even though, like I said, I didn't get any 5-star reads this month, and there were a lot of kind of mixed feelings about the books that I read, it was an enjoyable reading process. It opened up for a lot of discussion. I had a great time talking about these books with everybody on Discord and beyond. And I would love to know what you read in October. So please let me know what you read, what your favorite books were. If you've read any of the books that I talked about here, then, feel free to chat about those as well. And I will see you with another video soon. Bye.